The last man assigned to tear down the greatest city that never should have existed left behind a story no one wanted to hear. His name was Frank Bello, and by the time he stepped onto the grounds of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair in early 1894, the crowds were gone, the lights were off, and the dream known as the White City was already being erased. But here's where things start to fall apart. Because what Bello found inside those buildings didn't match the story the world had just celebrated. Not even close. We're told the fair was a miracle of American ambition, a city of over 200 grand buildings designed and constructed in just 2 years, massive exhibition halls, towering domes, intricate sculptures, all completed in time to welcome millions of visitors, then almost entirely demolished months later because they were temporary. That's the official version. But what if that version skips something important? Bello wasn't a tourist or a theorist. He was a demolition expert with years of experience tearing down real structures, factories, warehouses, buildings that revealed their truth the moment you broke through their walls. When his crew began dismantling the fairgrounds, he expected light frameworks, plaster coatings, cheap materials designed to impress briefly and disappear. Instead, he found something that shouldn't have been there at all. Solid stone, deep foundations, walls that resisted. And that changes everything. Because if you're demolishing temporary buildings, the job moves quickly. With splinters, plaster crumbles, structures collapse easily. But Bello's crew slowed down. What should have taken weeks stretched into months. They had to bring in heavier equipment because what they were tearing into wasn't temporary. It behaved like something built to last. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If these buildings were meant to stand for 6 months, why were they built like fortresses? As demolition continued, the inconsistencies multiplied. It wasn't just one building. It was all of them. Structures that should have been fragile felt permanent. Interiors didn't behave like quick builds, but like modified spaces. And that leads to a dangerous possibility. What if these buildings weren't built in 2 years? What if they weren't built for the fair at all? Now, this is where skepticism matters. The official explanation points to staff construction, a mix of plaster and fiber shaped over wooden frames to mimic stone. On paper, it makes sense. But when Bello's crew broke through the surface layers, what they expected to find often wasn't there. Instead of thin coatings over wood, they encountered dense brickwork, heavy materials, structural mass. Not decoration, real construction. And if that's true, the timeline starts to collapse. Because building something like that at that scale takes years, sometimes decades. Yet history insists it all happened between 1891 and 1893. So where are the records? Where are the detailed logs, the material sourcing, the excavation reports? You would expect mountains of documentation for a project this massive. Instead, what survives is selective. Plenty of photographs showing the finished beauty. Plenty of promotional material. But very little explaining exactly how it was built. And that absence matters. Because when something this large happens, records don't just vanish without reason. Then there were the materials themselves. Workers noticed signs of age, oxidation on metal, timber that didn't look freshly cut, subtle where patterns inconsistent with new construction. Even the environment raised questions. Mature trees, fully developed landscaping that didn't look newly planted but settled, natural, established. And moving large trees is extremely difficult even today. So now you're left with a puzzle. A city that appears fully formed, not just architecturally but environmentally, supposedly assembled in under 2 years. Not impossible, but highly unlikely. And when something is that unlikely, you don't ignore it. You investigate it. But that's not what happened. Instead, demolition accelerated and the rules became stricter. Materials weren't being preserved. They were being destroyed. And not casually, deliberately. Broken into pieces too small to reuse. Crushed beyond recognition. Erased. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If everything about the fair was exactly as advertised, why rush to destroy it so completely? Because if you build something extraordinary, you preserve it. You study it. You don't grind it into dust unless there's something you don't want examined. By the spring of 1894, Bello was no longer confused. He was unsettled. The inconsistencies were stacking, and then came a discovery that changed everything. Behind one wall, his crew uncovered brickwork stamped from a manufacturer that had ceased operations years before the fair began. That alone disrupts the timeline, because materials don't lie. If those bricks were older, then at least part of that structure existed before the official construction period. There's no easy explanation for that. In another section, they uncovered a hidden cornerstone embedded deep within the structure, carved with a date predating the fair. Cornerstones are placed at the beginning of construction. They are not randomly reused, especially not in temporary buildings, and they are certainly not hidden behind layers of plaster. Someone had intentionally covered it, and that implies awareness. It implies someone knew the date didn't fit the story. As more sections were dismantled, the pattern continued. Walls showed signs of modification, not creation. Openings that didn't match official layouts. Staircases leading nowhere. Features that suggested adaptation rather than fresh construction. And then came the contracts. This is where things become even harder to ignore. Because demolition is a business built on salvage. Materials are reused and sold. That's where profit comes from. But here, the contracts demanded total destruction. Stone broken into unusable fragments. Metal reduced to scrap. Decorative elements obliterated. Even valuable marble interiors were smashed where they stood. It wasn't demolition. It was eradication. Because when you prevent materials from leaving intact, you prevent analysis. You eliminate the chance that someone else might examine them and ask questions. And Bello was already asking those questions. He reached out to newspapers and publications. No one responded. No one showed interest, which is strange, because if a major historical project had inconsistencies, you would expect investigation. Instead, it was ignored. And that reaction says as much as the evidence itself. Because when a story is strong, it doesn't fear scrutiny. It survives it. As demolition neared completion, the White City vanished. Buildings reduced to rubble. Foundations buried. Land cleared. The physical evidence that could answer how it was built disappeared. And once it was gone, the official version was all that remained. Clean. Impressive. Untouched. Bello eventually stopped trying to be heard. Not because he found answers, but because no one wanted the questions. Decades passed. His letters sat forgotten while the fair became legend, a symbol of American progress. But physical evidence doesn't care about narratives. Over time, researchers began noticing inconsistencies, small at first, then forming patterns. Architectural details too refined for temporary construction. Structural features too strong for short-term use. Missing documentation where there should have been detailed records. And beneath the ground, surveys revealed deeper foundations than expected, the kind built for permanence, not temporary display. None of this definitively proves the buildings existed before the fair, but it complicates the story. And that's where the real significance lies. Not in replacing one narrative with another, but in recognizing that the official version may not explain everything. The World's Fair was more than an event. It was a statement about progress, power, and capability. A story that shaped reputations and identity. And when a story becomes that powerful, it resists being questioned. But questioning details isn't rewriting history. It's refining it. There are theories that go too far, try to explain everything with sweeping claims, but you don't need extreme conclusions to recognize something unusual happened. There were gaps. There were inconsistencies. And there was one man who saw it firsthand and tried to speak. That alone is enough to justify looking closer. Because real investigation doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with discomfort, with moments where something doesn't quite fit, and instead of ignoring it, you examine it. You question it. You test it. And sometimes you don't get perfect answers, but you get closer. So the next time you see images of the White City, those glowing buildings, those perfect reflections, pause. Ask yourself not just what you're seeing, but how it came to be. Because somewhere between the official timeline and the physical evidence, between construction and demolition, between what was shown and what was erased, there's a gap. And in that gap is where the real mystery lives. Frank Bello never got his answers. Maybe no one ever will. But the questions he left behind are still here, waiting for someone willing to take them seriously. What if everything you just heard is only a fragment of a much bigger hidden history, and the rest is still out there waiting to be uncovered? If this changed the way you see the world, hit subscribe now, because the next story goes even deeper. Share this with someone who questions everything, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you think about this. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, you're not alone, because the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. And here's the real question. Do you think this was simply an extraordinary construction project, or something far more complicated that history chose not to fully explain?